Bandura said, we disengage. We disengage from our constant moral judgment of ourselves, which lets us reframe our behaviors as morally permissible. And we do this so we can hold on to our values and our sense of self. We not only protect our sense of self through moral disengagement, we protect the beliefs that motivate that behavior. That money that we delivered to a friend who could do us a favor, it's not a bribe, it's a large tip or a pat on the back for a good job. What does all this intrapersonal tension and illusion, all these values and traits that make up our self, but then this self-protective tendency to believe those values and traits are not being degraded when we have missteps, what do all these intrapersonal factors mean for moral judgments and behavior directed at other people? So what about the interpersonal aspect of morality? First, let's look at how people judge each other. We know first that not only do we define the self according to our morality, others perceive who we are as a person through a moralized lens, by and large. The phenomenon that people believe in an essentially moral self has lots of interpersonal consequences. People are likely to make essentialist judgments of each other as fundamentally good or fundamentally bad. And these judgments of who a person is and whether they've changed as a person since some transgression can be a matter of freedom or incarceration, being forgiven and having a good life, or being stigmatized and held back. Indeed, as Mark Alex showed us, people judge each other in simplistic and holistic ways. A bad act can stain a person's character fully, so that their future actions are more likely to be judged in a negative light. Moral judgments about a person, for example, as a loyal team player, are influenced by the smallest or most irrelevant interpersonal cues, like the direction of the eyebrows, the heaviness of the brow, which cause a person to be perceived as dominant and less trustworthy, or an unusual request for a $40,000 marble table in your counteroffer for a job, which is then judged as evidence that the person is less suited for the job than a person with even an exorbitant salary request. Sometimes just being different is perceived in a moralized way, as though one intends trouble for the larger group, is not a team player. How do we get around such mindless moral judgment? One way is through effortful, rational thinking. You remember the path model of blame. It lays out a path for assessing blame that focuses first on the simplest judgment of an act. Was this a norm-violating event? The next step on the path is to assess agent causality. Who caused this norm-violating event? If the agent, that person, is assessed as non-causal, they did not make it happen, then the path model of blame says they get no blame. If it's determined that the agent was causal, they did make that norm-violating event happen, then we continue down the path through the yes to judgment of intentionality. Did the person intend to cause that norm-violating event to happen? If we conclude that the agent did intend to cause that norm-violating event, we continue down the yes path to reasons, where we generate reasons why this person might have intentionally caused that norm-violating event. It's in this process of reasoning that we can come upon reasonable justifications for that intentional action, or we can understand that it's unreasonable that that person intentionally caused that event. And from there, we can allocate degrees of blame. But say we determined that the person was unintentional. They really didn't want that event to happen. They didn't mean to cause that norm-violating event. Then we would go down the no path to assessing obligation. And that's when we consider, well, okay, they didn't intend to do it, but did they have an obligation to do it? Are they entrusted to prevent that sort of norm-violating event? If not, they're allocated low or no blame. If yes, it's determined that the person who was accidental or unintentional, that they were obligated to prevent that event. You continue down the path to capacity. And here, the reasoning involves assessing, well, yes, that person had an obligation, but did they have the capacity to fulfill that obligation? If we determine that they did not, the person's allocated low or no blame. But if we determine that they did have the capacity to fulfill that obligation they had, even though it was a mistake, they're blameworthy, and we allocate degrees of blame. Understanding the cause of an event and whether the person was intentional and did it on purpose or not, these are crucial to figuring out whether a person is to be blamed or not, and how people actually go about determining blame. But are these judgments of causality, of whether a person made the event happen, caused it, and intentionality, whether they meant to do it, are these really rational reasoning processes? Are they immune to the influence of our subjective values? According to some scholars, certainly not. Recall the chairman of the board vignettes. Intentionality is tied up with the good or bad nature of a side effect of a decision. So a chairman, his behavior having the side effect of harming the environment, is considered more intentional than a chairman who does the exact same thing with the side effect of the environment being helped. Morality, the moral valence, it affects a non-moral concept, the concept of intentionality. And this is important because it shows that a key step in assigning blame is not itself potentially infused with bias and information about blameworthiness. The path may be purely rational, but it doesn't capture the irrational, moralistic, self-favoring tendencies of humans' judgments of events, even at basic levels of cognition. It does push against that irrationality, though. But let's look at how event detection can vary, even at the most basic levels. At the start of the path, already people disagree on whether an event is norm violating often.